Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, Metamorphosis, curated by Tracy Longley Cook. Today, we are thrilled to present the artist Deborah Orloff. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode, so feel free to utilize that chat function to ask questions, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of the talk. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there might be some variation of bandwidth, so if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, we thank you in advance for bearing with us. All right, thank you everyone, and welcome, Deborah.
Thank you. I guess I just want to start out by saying thank you to Kat Sheridan, for inviting me to give this talk and for hosting this wonderful exhibition. And of course, I have to give a shout out to Tracy Longley Cook, who did such a beautiful job curating this show. It's a beautiful show, so if you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to go see it in person. So I'm gonna just talk a little bit about me. I was actually born and raised in New York City, and I lived in the Northeast, until I came to Ohio. So I got my BFA in photography at Clark University, which is in Massachusetts. So that's the small star in Massachusetts on the map, in case you're not familiar. And I got my MFA in photography at Syracuse University, which is in upstate New York. And then I moved from there, that's the large star on the left. And then I moved from there just a little bit further east to Albany, where I taught part-time for 2 years before coming to Ohio. But my interest in photography started much earlier. So if you're wondering why you're looking at this snapshot, I'm going to tell you. Um, the guy on the left in green is my Uncle Hank, my favorite uncle, and the other man is my father. And the two of them were the family photographers. They were both photo enthusiasts, and they were constantly taking pictures, and they documented all of the family happenings for all of my childhood. And when I was 16, I don't think it's a thing here, but on the East Coast, when girls turn 16, they have a sweet 16. And so my uncle wanted to get me something special for my birthday, and he asked me what I'd like, and I was really into astronomy at that time, and so I said I wanted a telescope. And now you have to understand, I grew up in New York City in a small apartment. So I get this big telescope, and my mother is like, what are you gonna do with that? And I'm like, oh, I'll just put it in my bedroom. I had this little porch outside my bedroom. I'm like, I'll just use it on the porch. And she was like, I don't think so. Why don't you let him get you something more practical? And so I said, well, I don't know, a camera, I guess. And that was it. And then there was kind of no turning back. So when I was in grad school, I had the opportunity to teach photography as a grad student, and I knew immediately that that was my calling, that I wanted to be a professor and a photographic artist. And so after teaching for 3 years in grad school, I moved to Albany and I taught part-time for 2 years. And then I was offered this wonderful position at the University of Toledo. And so you see here the Center for the Visual Arts, which was designed by Frank Gehry, and that's where I work. It's attached to the Toledo Museum of Art, and we're on our own little art campus of 4 buildings, and it's just fabulous, and I have great facilities. And these are my students who, in all fairness, aren't always that happy during a critique, but I try to make it as fun and encouraging as I can. But this is kind of my home away from home, and that's what I'm doing here. And so I moved from Albany to Toledo, and I'm currently a tenured professor of art. I'm the head of photography, and I'm also the associate chair. And of course, I'm also an artist. So I wear a lot of hats. I'm a good multitasker. And this is the work that's in the exhibition. So in case you haven't seen it yet, that's what's in the show, and I will be talking about that. But this work, Elusive Memory Constructed Histories, is part of a larger ongoing body of work, and there are now several distinct series under the umbrella of elusive memory, and all of them deal with the relationship between photography and memory, but each has a different focus and process or visual strategy. So I'm going to show you some of the work that led up to this and then come back to this in a couple of minutes. Elusive memory was initially a series of large-scale, high-resolution photographs of severely damaged family photographs. So these were objects that were found in my dad's basement after he died and that were literally heading to a dumpster. When my brother-in-law called, they were about to chuck all of these cartons full of cartons of photos that had been in the basement, and they were clearly damaged. And he called me up and he's like, before I throw these away, I just want to make sure you don't want them. I'm like, do not throw them away. And I had no idea what was going to be in these photographs. I'm sorry, what was going to be in the cartons. But this was one of the objects that was in those cartons, and I was really intrigued by these damaged photographs. So this is a Polaroid, and it's in the background, like on the top there, you can see there's some other photographs that are stuck to the back of it. And then the emulsion, the light sensitive part of the photograph is actually peeling off. And then these squiggly white lines that maybe you can see depending on the size of your screen, those are little fibers, paper fibers that are stuck to the emulsion from a photograph that was on top of that was stuck to it and then peeled off. So you'll see that in a lot of these images. And these are large scale images. So this is a 28 by 42 print. Okay. So, but the impetus for this work was actually an experience I had writing my dad's eulogy. So you're going to see a lot of pictures of my family today. This is my father reading to all of his grandchildren at Passover, and this was something that it brought him so much joy. This was something he loved. And when I was writing the eulogy, this is one of the pictures that I was imagining. So as I was drawing upon specific memories, which is what you do when you're writing a eulogy, I realized that I was picturing these 4x6 glossy snapshots in my mind, and I couldn't distinguish between my memories, or what I thought might be my memories, and the photographs that I was imagining. And so I started to wonder if I really remembered these things or if I just remembered the photographs. And at this point, I'm the person who's taking all of the family photographs. So where my uncle and my dad used to, basically, that was their role, it became my role. So I have all these photographs of all these family things, and at this point when I think about them, it's really hard for me to separate the memories from the photographs. And so when I had that epiphany, I knew I wanted to make work about it, but I really had no idea what that was going to look like. And so it sat on the back burner for a while until I got these damaged photographs. And so I started photographing the objects themselves that were in my dad's basement, and enlarging them to 42 inches. And it wasn't until I saw them enlarged on a big computer screen and started making test prints that I realized that this is the project. So in case you couldn't figure out what you're looking at, that red box is the area that's enlarged there. So it's the elbow. This is a studio portrait of a baby. It's actually me, but of course you can't really tell. And the enlarged area, what you're seeing there is what this would look like in a gallery. That's how much detail you see when you see the 42-inch print. So it's very different than seeing the original object, which is a little 2x3 wallet photograph. And remember, this is just a photograph of a photograph, so it's flat. And all those textures that you see that look like peeling paint are just because it's a macro photograph, and I'm using the light so that it just rakes across the surface. And even though when you're holding this object, you can't see any texture at all, at 42 inches, you see all of this texture of the emulsion that's kind of peeling and cracked. And again, those little white fibers that are paper fibers from other photographs that had been stuck to this. So that's really what you experience when you see these in person. Again, you can't see that with the naked eye when you're holding the actual object. And just to give you an idea of what these look like in real space, these are a couple of installation shots, so you can see the scale. That's my daughter, who's not very happy that I'm photographing her, but it gives you a good sense of the scale. And I was especially drawn to the images that had missing or obscured faces. These are representations of people, but they have no visual identities. And especially in relation to memory, this really spoke to me. These images became metaphors for the way memory is fragmented and incomplete. And I wanted to evoke the feeling of trying to remember, when you're trying to recall details that you just can't quite see. I felt like these images became kind of a stand-in for that. And so when I was choosing images to photograph and print, I was choosing based on those criteria. Or in this case, I chose this because of the unknown identity, so just the opposite. Um, the title of this is Remembering Uncle Philip, and that title is ironic because when I saw this is a stack of photographs that are stuck together, and when I saw this top photograph, I didn't recognize the person, and then I thought, oh, that's Uncle Philip. And then I realized, wait a minute, I don't know what Uncle Philip looks like. This is just my dad's friend, when I was a kid. And so I named it Remembering Uncle Philip, ironically. So the work is also about misremembering, not just the lost identities, but also the way we misremember when we look at photographs. Similarly, when I found this picture, and that's me when I was 4 years old, I immediately remembered my favorite dress. This was a textured gray velvet dress with a pink satin sash, which you can't, of course, see in this photograph because of the damage. And then I realized there's no way I remember a dress that I wore when I was 4 years old. What I remember is my mother telling me that this was my favorite dress. And so this is an example of what the writer Marion Hirsch would call a post memory. So it's a memory that has been kind of passed down and mediated by someone else. So in this case, my mother, who I guess when I was a kid, she showed me photographs that weren't damaged, that you could see the whole dress with the bow, and talked about that being my favorite dress. And so now I realize that's what I actually remember. It's the other photos and the stories attached to the photographs, not the dress itself. And again, this speaks to this kind of slippery relationship between photography and memory. Right? We see photographs and it stimulates memories, but those memories are not always accurate, and very often they're not. So as I was making these pieces, I was also thinking about the loss of family histories that are associated with these images and how little I actually knew about my lineage. This piece is called Possible Ancestors because when I made it, no one in my family could identify the subject of the photographs. But postscript, a couple of years ago, I was giving a lecture in North Carolina, and a distant cousin of mine who I'd never met showed up at the talk and recognized this person and was able to identify this as my great grandfather, Max Orloff, which was absolutely thrilling to me. But now makes the title even better because it seems more appropriate that the title is now inaccurate since memories can be so unreliable. So again, the title is Possible Ancestors, but now I know it actually was my ancestor. And so while I'm doing this work, in 2020, I started a related project. I was really thinking about this idea of lost stories. And so still under the umbrella of elusive memory, but focused on lost personal stories, I started doing the next iteration of elusive memory, and this is elusive memory lost histories. And so the images that I just showed you, again, those were very large scale prints. Those are uniformly sharp. And they emphasize all of these details of the surfaces. But the second iteration of the project utilizes shallow depth of field, so there's very little in focus. And these are small, they're very intimate. These range anywhere from 7 by 10 to 16 by 18 inches. This one's um, pretty small. It's about maybe that big. So these are small still life images. So I'm setting up three-dimensional still lifes and then photographing them. And they intentionally deny the viewer most of the visual information that photographs are really expected to reveal. And so this was the beginning of a series. I wanted to underscore what can't be known when you're looking at vernacular photographs. So especially the stories that are lost as relatives die and their memories disappear. So in these photos, identities are typically obscured along with other details, like there's a letter in the background here that you can tell it's a letter, you can tell that there's handwriting, but you really can't read it. So kind of messing with the viewer a little bit when it comes to that. So I'm showing you something, but I'm not showing it to you. And again, this was intentional and meant to talk about these things that we just can't know because the information is gone. So the visual information in these photographs is generally very limited, and that's to reinforce the idea that memories are attached to photographs, which are fallible, and family stories are often misremembered or just lost altogether. And, while this phenomenon is certainly not unique to my family, it's complicated by the fact that I come from a diasporic culture where records from Russia and Eastern Europe largely cease to exist, and histories depend on oral traditions. So the work was partly inspired by my experience with genealogy research, which I've been doing for a very long time. And in spite of that, there's very little information about my family going back more than a couple of generations. I do know that my ancestors lived in the parts of Russia that are now Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and Lithuania. And on this map, that's the area in green. And in the 1800s and early 1900s, this area was known as the Pale of Settlement. And this is the area that all Jews were forced to live during this time. So basically from about 1825 to the 1915, all of the Jews in Russia, because this was all Russia at the time, they were all forced to live in this one small area, right? You think of Russia as a huge, huge area. And so this is a relatively small area. So you had millions of Jews living in this small area, and they were frequently subjected to pogroms, which, if you're not familiar with that term, these are state-sanctioned violence, looting, mass killings. There was also discriminatory laws that led to economic hardship. So clearly, it was a difficult life. And so all of that led to a huge wave of immigration as millions of Jews fled persecution in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And so this was the context for my family eventually coming to the United States. So they lived in those areas. Most of them came here in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so and there's very little information about them prior to coming here. But I was really thinking a lot about the immigrant experience and what their experience might have been like. And so as I was making these images, I was thinking about that. And so I used a number of, in a number of these images, I used passport photos and ID cards. And I was really, in this one in particular, I was really struck by what to me feels like violence of the photograph, the way the stamp is like embossed right across somebody's face. And I noticed that in a lot of the documents. And I know that that was just pragmatic, but it feels like a violation to me. And maybe that's because in my practice, photographs are always meant to be taken care of and, very precious. And so this seemed, I don't know, it seemed like a violation to me. Uh, but like all the images in this series, I was intentionally obscuring, identifying information to talk about what can't be known and all of the lost personal histories. That investigation led to my current body of work, Elusive Memory Constructed Histories, which is a physical collage project that I started last year. And in this series, I'm physically cutting people out of photographs from my personal archive and juxtaposing them with images I made in Europe in 2024 when I spent 3 months there photographing sites that related to my personal ancestry and Jewish history more generally. And to be clear, I'm physically cutting the actual family photographs with an X-Acto knife. This is not Photoshop. These are physical collages. And the vernacular photograph, the family photograph, is then glued on top of a pigment print, which is an archival inkjet print of a photograph that I made in Europe. And the titles refer to the site of that color background photograph. So in this case, the title is Railroad Tracks to Panerai. And so that refers to that background photo, the color photograph here. And those railroad tracks are going toward Panerai was a site, a mass execution site during the Holocaust. So you'll see a lot of this kind of juxtaposition where you've got something happy and sort of normal, and then the juxtaposition of something Holocaust related. Not all of the photographs have Holocaust references, but a number of them do. So I'll come back to that. But this photo is the black and white photo is my mother at her wedding dancing with her father, my grandfather. So, and he's the one that's cut out. So in all of these, there's a physically cut out photo and then my photograph from Europe, and you're seeing one through the other. So hopefully that makes sense. A lot of people assume that they're Photoshopped and they're not. And then here are a couple of installation views from a recent exhibition so you can see how they're presented in case you haven't seen them in person at the Rife Gallery. Most of them are very small. They're finished in 11 by 14 and 16 by 20 maple frames with white spacers and a good amount of white space around them. But because of their size, and some of these are as small as like 4 by 5 inches, they're really quite small. And so the viewer has to get close to them to see them. And so I'm intentionally creating this very intimate viewing experience. The snapshot on the right gives you, I think, a sense of the scale and also how close people have to get to look at these. Again, the titles refer to the background photograph, so the photograph that you're seeing through the family photograph. And in this image, this is called Białystok Ghetto Map. I actually took a photograph of a map of the Białystok Ghetto when I was in Poland. And what you're looking at is the family photograph is actually a studio portrait of my sister, and I've cut out most of her, as you can see. And then that red squiggly line you see on the map is the border. That's actually where the ghetto wall was during the Warsaw Ghetto. So, and then the word proof was stamped across this photograph because for those of you who are young, back in the day when a professional photographer did portraits, they would give you these physical prints and they would stamp the word proof on it so that you had to actually buy the photograph. You couldn't reproduce it and you obviously couldn't use it. So that's what you're looking at here. But the word proof in this case has kind of a double meaning. So the proof refers to the photographic proof, right? But it also refers to proof that the Warsaw Ghetto was real, that this was part of history, and that the Holocaust occurred, because there are actually still a lot of people who deny that it ever happened. So so that's what's going on in this image. I did have ancestors from Bialystok, but my sister obviously was was born long after the after World War II. So I'm intentionally kind of conflating time and people and places. So my sister was born in the United States in the late 60s. Uh, the ghetto existed during World War II in Poland, right? So, very different. And then the one thing that brings them together is the fact that obviously my sister and I, we have ancestors who lived in Bialystok. So that's kind of the connection, but I'm intentionally conflating time and place and people. Um, this image is a family photograph. I don't actually know who the people are in the photograph. The only people who were identified on the back of the photograph were the two people I cut out, and they're distant relatives. But judging by the look of the photograph and the way people are dressed, I would say it's probably a wedding or a bar mitzvah in the 70s. And that's about as much as I know about it. The background photograph here is a neighborhood in Munich where I believe my Max Orloff and his family lived. So I know for a fact that my paternal great grandparents who fled Odessa around 1892 lived in Munich for 2 years before coming to the United States. And so when I was in Europe, I spent time doing research in Munich's archives, trying to at least find a street address because I wanted to photograph where they lived, but I couldn't actually find a street address. So I photographed the area where I'm pretty sure they lived, but more the general area. And that was based on the one document that I actually have. And so that's the neighborhood and what it looks like now. Um, the As I said, the group photograph, I don't actually know who these people are, but presumably their family. And I recently learned that of that family who immigrated from Munich, from Odessa to Munich to the United States, I always thought that all of them had come here in the late 1800s, but when I was doing research, I actually learned that one of my ancestors stayed back in Munich and was a victim of the Holocaust. And this seems like a really important story to have been unaware of. But none of my relatives, or at least none of my living relatives, knew about this history. It was never mentioned when I was growing up. And it was only by chance that I came across a variation of the name Orloff in a memorial in Munich. And when I did the research, I was able to confirm that my ancestor was, in fact, killed and memorialized as part of Munich's official records. And to me, this is a really important story to have been lost, which, is kind of the point of the work. But it's been kind of a haunting thing to learn. Uh, this photograph is my mom's wedding, and my mom and her brother are on the right there, and the person cut out is my father. And what you see through his silhouette is a close-up of a pew in a synagogue in Vilna. So according to DNA testing I took a few years ago, I had ancestors living in Lithuania, but I don't know what city. And so I just know that they were from that area. So Vilna was called the Jerusalem of the North because it had such a huge Jewish population. And so I'm assuming that that's where they lived. If that's not the case, I guess that works too because I'm talking about lost stories. But that's why I chose to make photographs. Sorry. That's why I chose to make photographs in Vilna. This is a group photo here from my cousin's bar mitzvah. And the three people I cut out of this one are my mother, my grandmother, and my aunt, who are all deceased, but everybody else in the photograph is alive. So sometimes I do that. Sometimes the people I cut out, I'm intentionally cutting out because of something like that. In other cases, it's more an aesthetic choice. So it kind of depends on the image. But the texture that you're seeing through that hole where they're cut out is a close-up of a decaying wall in a Lithuanian prison. And so again, I'm dealing with that irony of the juxtaposition of the two images, and that's intentional. Um, and of course, in all of these, conflating time and place, because this photograph was probably, looks like it was probably in the 90s. And the Lithuanian prison dates back, many, many, many years. And of course, the photograph was taken in New York, and the prison is in Europe. In all of these collages, the background photos are made in cities where my ancestors lived or likely lived, and they depict neighborhoods, synagogues, or where synagogues once stood, Jewish cemeteries, and other sites related to Jewish history, including but not limited to the Holocaust. The background photo in this image is actually an excavation site where the great synagogue in Vilna once stood, but like all synagogues in Europe, were destroyed during World War II. When I was there, they had just started this excavation, and I may have talked myself into the site so that I could photograph it. You're not supposed to go in there, but I did get permission. And when I was there, really all you could see was a little bit, but those sort of white squares that you see, that's part of the building. And that's pretty much all you could really see of the excavation, other than, a lot of dirt and rubble, things like that. And this is a camp photograph from when I went to day camp. It's a pretty generic image. And this is another one, very similar, taken a year later. And this one is also placed over part of that same excavation site, but a different part of it. And here you're seeing some of that rubble. And so when I was making these images, I was struck by the similarities between the two camp photos and how generic they looked. So here they are side by side. And so even though they were taken a year apart, and they're mostly they're different people, they just felt so similar. And so I hang these next to each other to illustrate that slippery relationship between photography and memory, and how easily we misremember and confuse details when we're looking at photographs. And that's certainly a thread that runs through all of my work. This is this is a gravestone in the Jewish cemetery of the Bialystok ghetto, which again was one of the few cities that I know for sure my ancestors lived. And I found a scholar there who was able to help me find my ancestor's gravestone. We don't know exactly whose grave it was, but because the cemetery was destroyed, but he was able to actually help me find that gravestone, which I thought was really exciting. This is a photograph of my mom and my dad on the right when they were dating with their college friends, and the green that you see in the hole there is a rabbinical cemetery in Bialystok. And in this one, I had scaled up that image and placed it so that there were a couple of little gravestones on the grass. Other than that, it was just a park. You had really no indication of what was there. But I lined up those gravestones so that it kind of mimicked the way their arms are folded in the photograph. So sometimes I'm making those kinds of formal decisions. Other times it's for different reasons. But in this case, it was the way they lined up. And that's similarly in this one, I lined up the tree in the black and white photograph with the tree in the background. This was another Jewish cemetery that was destroyed during World War II. This one is in Berlin. And I have no idea who was in the black and white photograph. It was a picture of a woman and her dog, and no idea who they are. This is a black and white photograph of my dad at his prom, and my mom is cut out here. And the very peaceful, beautiful looking forest that you see in the background is actually a mass execution site in, this is called Penere. and this is in a forest outside of Vilna. So this is where the railroad tracks in that first image led to. And this is a site where over 75,000 people, primarily Jewish, were taken and shot in the woods during the Holocaust. Now, my father was born and raised here after the war, but if his grandparents had not left Europe when they did, he could have just as easily grown up there and been a victim. And so for me, seeing this young man in the context of Panerai is a really powerful reminder that the victims were all innocent people, just like him, just like us, whose lives and experiences were probably very similar until they were deported and killed. So that's really meaningful to me, and one of the reasons that I'm doing this type of juxtaposition. This is a black and white photograph from my parents' wedding, and the background here is a KGB prison in Lithuania. So again, another place where innocent people ended up. This one is a snapshot from a trip to Italy, just a vacation photo with the couple cut out. And the background is the great synagogue in Bialystok. Well, it's where the synagogue once stood. That it was destroyed, of course, by the Nazis. So in all of these collages, the voids where people have been cut out represent not only lost individuals, but also missing family stories and my desire to create histories where they don't really exist. Um, Collage is inherently nonlinear. It's kind of the perfect process for addressing these issues that I'm exploring, because I'm grappling with trying to make visible that which is invisible, while ironically using a medium that's associated with documenting, um, you know, truth and people and events, right? So I'm using a medium that's meant to be documentary to talk about what one can't know. So that irony is not lost on me. And this is the last one I'm going to show you. The background photo here is an execution pit in the Panerai Forest, which I talked about earlier. And the cutout picture is a vacation snapshot. This is the first time I've worked with physical collage, and I'm really intrigued by the fragmentary nature and its ability to collapse time and merge past and present. And I think it makes us aware that we never fully see the picture when we're looking at photographs, right? Photographs are inherently incomplete. And I love the way collage forces us to slow down and to pay attention to details and to try to make sense of them. All of these photographs are they're pieces that are filled with contradictions and ambiguity. They simultaneously represent absence and presence. They speak to both memory and what has been forgotten. And they only hint at unresolved narratives that, like my family history, can never be fully known. So thank you. And I'm going to actually turn this over to Kat Sheridan for Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you, Deborah. Folks, if you have questions, please pop them into the comments and we'll get to them. I think I'd like to start with maybe what's most obvious, which is there is an importance in using the actual photos. Can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, it was very painful. Family photographs have always been very precious to me, and conceptually, it felt really important to cut the actual photographs, even though that was really painful. But it just felt like it would have been hypocritical to, I don't know, scan them or and use like reproductions of them. Um, that said, I have not cut up my most precious photographs. There are photographs that I will not cut up. A lot of these I had duplicates, so a lot of the ones of my parents' wedding, there was more than one. And so I, cut up ones that were the duplicates. Other photographs were just less precious, and I have so many. I've literally hundreds and hundreds of images. So there were certainly plenty, and I'm happy to have them, kind of live on, right? Because they're just sitting in boxes. So,
Yeah, and there's also a intention
Hmm.
in a recognition that others would have an empathy towards the preciousness of those photos.
Yeah.
And so, like, there's also an intention there as the artist in wanting a viewer to come and recognize the willingness
Hmm.
to impact a precious piece, right? So like
Yeah.
that's a part of it. It's a built emotion layering, stacking
Yep.
within
Yeah.
this
And
work.
a lot of people, when I show this work, a lot of people ask because they assume that they're not the actual photographs, and I can see people's faces, like people just cringe when they hear that these are the actual photos. But these memories have been ripped from us, and so it just felt like I had to do that, as hard as it is. So
Yeah,
I
it
think,
seems a requirement of the work.
yeah, I think so.
So it is necessarily a work that is rooted in grief.
Mhm.
And so I wonder, there are some really happy images too.
Mhm.
I wonder at um, the hope for both yourself in the process of making this work and those that are receiving the
Mhm.
content of it. If you could chat a little bit about both of those
Hmm.
things.
It's a great question. Um, I guess I don't know. I mean, I just touched on this a second ago, but I feel like this is a using these photographs is in some ways a way to perpetuate the memories of these people, because I mean they do live on in our memories to whatever extent they do, but now they like physically live on and they're out in the public, and I guess there's something kind of hopeful about that. And then also, people, I think there's something very universal about this. So even though these are all photographs of my family, they're not really, I mean, as far as like in the art context, they're not about my family, right? I mean, everybody has family photographs and memories and lost memories. And in all of my work, I want people to connect to that universal. I always try to find what's universal in sort of the thing that starts out as personal. And so, I don't know, hopefully people can connect to that and think about their own family histories, their own memories or lack thereof. Um, but yeah, I think at the end of the day, it allows these photographs and the people to some extent to kind of live on.
Have you found yourself um, in a different emotional or headspace since the start of this project? And if so, can you tell us about it?
Yeah. Um, it's been a pretty intense journey. Spending 3 months in Europe, I went to a lot of concentration camps and sites that are associated with World War II. That wasn't really my intention when I planned the trip. Originally, I thought I was just going to places that were related to my ancestors, places they lived, and I was looking to photograph old houses and neighborhoods and synagogues and Jewish cemeteries. And yeah, because Jewish history more generally, the Holocaust is really important. That's also part of my history more generally. But I really didn't set out to make all these images that had to do with the Holocaust. But my very first week in Poland, I went to Auschwitz, and on the way back from Auschwitz, I had a tour guide, and he mentioned this place called Plaszow, and I'd never heard of it. And he said it was a concentration camp, but it's basically a park now. And so I said, "Can we stop there?" And so we went there, and I photographed it, and it literally was a park. I mean, people were walking their dogs there, probably completely unaware that it was ever a concentration camp. And that experience changed the whole rest of my trip. So at that point, I was like, okay, there's a second project here. And so I was actively photographing for these collages places that were related to my ancestry, and also documenting all of these Holocaust sites, many of which there's nothing left and there's no indication. And so that became very emotional. And I've been doing a ton of research about the Holocaust and reading and watching documentaries. And so it's been pretty heavy. It wasn't really, I didn't know I was going to go down this path. It was never my intention, but it's been pretty intense and emotional. And then, of course, finding out that I had an ancestor who died in the Holocaust, only amplified that.
So this opus of work also serves as kind of a reflection of the possibilities, both good and bad, of humanity. And so I wonder if you have meaningful conversations with folks who are reflecting upon our current state and how you navigate that.
Hmm. I do. Um, Unfortunately, it's something I think about a lot. There's obviously been a rise of authoritarianism, there's been a rise in anti-Semitism. Um, so that's certainly related to the Holocaust. The Holocaust happened very much because Hitler was able to rise to power, and very much like what is happening in our country and in a lot of countries, as leaders, even if they're elected officials, as they consolidate their power and take away power from the rest of the system, um, they're able to do things that nobody thought could ever happen. I mean, Germany before the war was a very civilized, cultured, sophisticated civilization, just like, I mean, very similar to the way we live. And people never imagined that what happened could happen. And in fact, when people started finding out what was going on, um, they were like, "Oh no, that there's no way. These are exaggerations. It's not possible." And so I think about that and I see all these parallels between what's going on in many countries right now, um, and how that actually kind of bubbled up and took place in Europe. And so I see those parallels and I think about that a lot. And it's kind of scary. Do I think that, that the United States is going to have another Holocaust and mass murder Jews? No. But things like this can and do happen. I mean, the United States had concentration camps. I mean, we weren't, you know, mass killing people, but we had concentration camps during World War II. The Japanese were interned. So these things do happen. And so I think that we have to learn from history and make sure that we're not repeating those things, not making those same mistakes. And I have to say, Germany has been really good about owning up to what happened and taking responsibility for that so that that can't happen again.
So I want to return it to kind of some formal aspects of the
Yeah,
work. The layout of the pieces is really intentional. Can you talk
yeah.
a little bit about how you're layering there and what you hope that folks have discovery if they give themselves the treat of a long look, what they discover in that?
Yeah. Yeah, well, again, people aren't going to necessarily know who the people are in the photographs. They're really pretty generic photographs in that sense, so they can connect to them, hopefully. And then the connection between the photograph on top, the family photograph, and the background, there's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of room for people to kind of make stories or try to fill in the gaps, and so it becomes very participatory in that sense. But the layout of the pieces arranged on the wall that way, I was actually working with a friend of mine who's a kind of brilliant curator, and we were playing around with it, and we realized that it could look like when you have a photo album and there are photographs missing, and so we were trying to just, subtly recreate that. And so these, you can see, there's like a sort of a grid, but there are missing pieces. And so that was meant to reference those missing photographs, and then of course by extension the missing histories, memories, all of that. So yeah, that was intentional.
As we are coming to kind of the culmination of this talk, are there things that you would offer to folks who are exploring heavier subject matter or precious items that you have learned along the way?
Um, yeah, self-care is important. It's funny, yesterday I was talking to a colleague and he asked me like, how do I, how do I deal with the heaviness of all of this? And I said, well, I take walks, I do yoga, um, the occasional martini. You just have to do whatever you need to do, because, it's important, but you also don't want to live in that space all the time. So I think finding balance, which is something I think all of us struggle with, artists and professors, we all struggle with finding balance anyway. And this is just yet another balance that I think you have to try to find. And sometimes you find it and sometimes you don't. But I think that if a project is meaningful, you push through it and it's worth it. It's certainly worth it. And I've had some great discussions with people. And that's been really gratifying.
And then I think my last question for you is, oh, I think we actually have a question. Hold on one second. Um, So Laz has said there's a universal element to your multimedia artwork, and so many families of different backgrounds have similar experiences of having lost histories. Gives
Yes.
me It gives one an impulse uh, to get all those vintage family photographs sitting in boxes in closets to view them with an eye towards Eureka, I have a new art project. So I believe a bit of a thank you.
Yeah,
Um,
you're welcome.
what I would love for you to wrap us with is the premise of this exhibition, Metamorphosis, is about the persistence of change. And so I wonder how you come to the exhibition and being in the company of other wonderful artists. How are you reflecting upon that, and what would you like to add?
That's a great question. I thought about that when I came and saw the show in person, and I was really struck by how different everyone's work is. And I think Tracy did an amazing job of sort of finding this very thin through line that somehow the work all feels connected, and yet is all very different. And yeah, I mean, certainly this notion of change, and becoming, I think, is manifest certainly in the physicality of this. I mean, I guess that's the obvious one, because I'm taking photographs, well, disparate photographs, and by juxtaposing them, completely changing their meaning, and also changing them physically. So there's a lot of change just within, the images and the collages just physically. Um, as far as maybe more conceptually, I think that, it's a little bit of an overstatement to say photographs change the world, but I think that art and photography can affect people, and they can affect people maybe on a more of a micro level. But I think people are affected by art, and sometimes people have these epiphanies. Maybe it's just a matter of encouraging people to take the photographs out of those, non-archival boxes and envelopes, and put them in archival boxes to preserve them, and write who's on the photograph on the backs of the photographs, so that the next generation hopefully gets them and knows who the people are. Um, there's that change too, the change from generation to generation. So yeah, there are a lot of different ways that change is manifest in my work, and I think in everybody else's work.
Yeah. Wonderful. That's perfect. Deb, thank you so much for
Thank you.
the generosity of your time and your talent in these tender, somber, beautiful, delicate works that you shared with us. Thank you all for joining us for this artist talk as a part of our programming for Metamorphosis. A special thank you to Tracy, as well as to the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio legislature, and the governor who support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks everyone and have a great day.